The wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of rain and distant lightning. Elena Cruz pulled her weathered jacket tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down the narrow mountain trail, her boots finding purchase on the slick stones with the confidence of someone who had walked these paths for 30 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She had come to the Cascade Mountains after her divorce, seeking solitude and healing in the wilderness that had always called to her soul. What was meant to be a temporary retreat had become a permanent home. Now at 52, she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Her small cabin sat nestled in a clearing 3 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by Douglas firs and hemlock trees that touched the sky. The storm had passed through the night before, one of those fierce mountain tempests that made the cabin walls shudder and the windows rattle in their frames. Elena had spent the evening by the fire, reading by lamplight and listening to the thunder roll through the valleys. Now, in the pale morning light, she was checking her trap lines and ensuring that the storm hadn't damaged any of her equipment or the surrounding trails she maintained. As she rounded a bend where the path overlooked a steep ravine, something caught her eye. A splash of brown and white against the dark rocks below, moving weakly. Elena's heart quickened. She'd seen enough injured animals in her time here to recognize distress when she saw it. Carefully, she made her way down the rocky slope, using exposed roots and sturdy saplings to steady her descent. The ground was treacherous, still slick from the rain, and loose stones skittered away beneath her feet. But Elena was patient and methodical, testing each handhold before trusting it with her weight. As she drew closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was an eagle, a magnificent bald eagle, its white head stained with blood, one wing held at an unnatural angle. The bird's fierce yellow eyes tracked her approach, and it opened its hooked beak in a weak attempt at defiance. But it was clearly too injured to fly or fight. "Easy there." "Beautiful," Elena murmured, her voice low and soothing. "I'm not going to hurt you." She'd helped injured animals before, owls, deer, even a young bear cub once, but never an eagle. These birds were protected, powerful, and potentially dangerous even when wounded. But looking into those fierce, intelligent eyes, Elena knew she couldn't leave it here to die. She slowly removed her jacket, talking softly the entire time, explaining what she was doing. The eagle watched her with an intensity that was almost unnerving. When she moved to drape the jacket over the bird's body, it didn't struggle. It was as if the eagle understood that she was there to help. Carefully, Elena wrapped the eagle in her jacket, being cautious of its talons and beak. The bird was heavier than she expected, solid and muscular beneath its feathers. She could feel its heart beating rapidly against her arms. The injured wing dragged limply, and Elena's trained eye spotted what looked like a deep gash along the bird's breast, probably from a collision with a tree during the storm. The climb back up to the trail was arduous with the additional weight, and Elena's muscles burned with the effort. Twice she had to stop and catch her breath, adjusting her grip on her precious cargo. The eagle remained remarkably still, only its eyes moving, watching the world pass by with an awareness that seemed almost human. By the time Elena reached her cabin, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows through the trees. Her arms ached, and she was breathing hard, but a sense of purpose filled her chest. She carried the eagle inside and gently laid it on her kitchen table, on top of several layers of old towels. The bird's eyes never left her face as she carefully unwrapped it and began to assess its injuries. The wing was definitely broken. She could see the unnatural bend in the bone, and the gash on its breast was deep but had stopped bleeding. There were other scrapes and bruises visible beneath the feathers, evidence of a violent impact. Elena had basic veterinary supplies for treating her own minor injuries and those of the occasional wounded creature she encountered. She knew this eagle needed more help than she could provide, but the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was 4 hours away on dangerous mountain roads that were probably still treacherous from the storm. she made a decision. She would stabilize the eagle here, keep it warm and safe, and then make the journey to the rehabilitation center tomorrow when the roads were safer. She'd done basic field medicine before, working with injured animals on her father's ranch as a child. And she'd learned more during her years in the mountains, working slowly and methodically. Elena cleaned the wounds with warm water and antiseptic. The eagle flinched but didn't strike at her. She fashioned a splint for the wing using medical tape and light wooden strips, immobilizing it as best she could. It wasn't professional work, but it would keep the bone from moving until proper help could be found. As she worked, Elena found herself talking to the eagle, telling it about her life in the mountains, about the seasons she'd witnessed here, the animals she'd known. The bird seemed to listen, its eyes bright and alert despite its pain. When she finished, she prepared a soft nest of blankets in a large wooden crate and carefully transferred the eagle inside. She placed the crate near the fireplace where it would stay warm, but not too hot. Then she prepared some small pieces of fresh trout she'd caught the day before, offering them to the bird. To her surprise, after a moment's hesitation, the eagle ate. Elena sat back in her chair, watching the magnificent creature rest in its makeshift nest, and felt a connection she couldn't quite explain. There was something about those intelligent eyes, the way the bird seemed to understand what was happening, that touched something deep in her soul. Outside, the mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping whatever secrets they held close. Elena had no way of knowing that saving this eagle's life would lead her down a path she never could have imagined, to a discovery that would change everything. For now, she was simply content to have given this beautiful creature a fighting chance. As darkness fell over the mountains that night, Elena checked on the eagle one last time before bed. The bird was sleeping, its chest rising and falling with steady breaths. She smiled softly and whispered, "Rest well, friend. Tomorrow we'll get you real help." The eagle's eyes opened briefly, seeming to meet hers with something that looked almost like gratitude, before closing again. Elena climbed the ladder to her loft bedroom, unaware that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary adventure. The journey to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center the next morning tested every bit of Elena's mountain driving skills. The roads twisted and turned, still slick with moisture, and twice she had to carefully navigate around fallen branches. But she drove with steady determination, the eagle secure in its crate on the passenger seat beside her, Dr. Maria Santos, the director of the Wild Wings Rehabilitation Center, met her at the entrance with practiced efficiency. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and capable hands. She took one look at Elena's splinting work and raised an eyebrow appreciatively. "You've done this before," she said, carefully examining the eagle without removing Elena's bandaging. "Farm girl turned mountain hermit," Elena replied with a slight smile. "You learned to make do." Dr. Santos worked quickly, taking x-rays and properly setting the wing, while Elena watched anxiously from the observation window. The eagle, sedated now, looked smaller and more vulnerable under the harsh medical lights. But Dr. Santos was skillful and gentle, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who had saved countless birds. An hour later, the doctor emerged, pulling off her surgical gloves. "The wing will heal," she told Elena. "It was a clean break, and your splint kept it from getting worse. The wounds on the breast are superficial. This bird was lucky you found it when you did. Another day out there, an infection would have set in." Relief flooded through Elena. "How long until it can be released?" 6 to 8 weeks minimum, Dr. Santos said. "These injuries take time. We'll need to keep it here for observation. Physical therapy once the wing starts to heal." She paused, studying Elena's face. "You can visit if you'd like. We encourage it with the people who rescue our patients. It's good for the birds to have consistent human contact during recovery. Helps keep their stress levels down." Elena found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the commitment. "I'd like that." And so began a routine that would shape the next 2 months of Elena's life. 3 times a week, she made the long drive down from the mountains to visit the eagle. Dr. Santos had tagged it as patient number 247. But Elena privately called it Aurelius, after Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. There was something regal and wise about the bird that reminded her of the ancient writings she'd studied in college, lifetimes ago. The first few visits, Aurelius remained distant, watching her with those fierce yellow eyes, but showing no recognition. But gradually something shifted. By the third week, the eagle would move to the front of its large rehabilitation enclosure when Elena arrived, head tilting as if listening to her voice. Dr. Santos remarked that it was unusual behavior. Then Aurelius landed on a particularly large boulder directly ahead and refused to move. The eagle called out repeatedly, a sharp, insistent cry that seemed to demand Elena's attention. Elena approached carefully, scanning the area around the boulder. At first she saw nothing unusual, just more rocks, more shadows, more jumbled terrain. But as she drew closer and moved around to the far side of the boulder, her breath caught. There, concealed behind the massive rock and almost completely hidden by overgrowth and smaller stones, was an opening in the cliff face. Not a natural cave exactly, but something that looked deliberately shaped, a vertical crack in the rock that had been widened and smoothed by human hands. Sometime in the distant past, Elena's heart pounded, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She'd heard stories of old mines in these mountains, abandoned claims from the gold rush era of the 1800s. Some had been found and documented, but local lore spoke of others that remained hidden, lost to time and the wilderness that had reclaimed them. She pulled out her flashlight and tested it, still strong. Then she looked up at Aurelius, who remained perched on the boulder, watching her with those intense eyes. "Is this what you wanted to show me?" she asked. The eagle chirped softly, a sound she'd learned meant contentment or approval. Elena took a deep breath, checked to make sure her knife was secure and her phone was in her pocket, though there was no signal here, and approached the opening. It was narrow but passable, perhaps 3 feet wide and maybe 7 feet high. She could see rough tool marks in the stone, definitely human work and old. Clicking on her flashlight, Elena squeezed through the opening into darkness. The beam of her light revealed a passage that extended back into the mountain, its walls showing clear signs of having been worked with hand tools. The floor was surprisingly level, covered with a fine dust that puffed up with each step. The air was cool and dry, carrying the mineral scent of deep stone. Elena moved forward cautiously, her light sweeping back and forth across the passage walls. She'd explored abandoned mines before and knew the dangers, unstable ceilings, hidden shafts, bad air. But this passage seemed sound, the rock solid and stable. After about 30 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Elena played her flashlight around the space, and her jaw dropped. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to about 12 feet at its highest point. But what made her gasp were the unmistakable signs of human habitation and work. Against one wall stood a rough wooden table, miraculously preserved in the dry air, though cobwebs draped it like ghostly lace. Mining tools, a pickaxe, a shovel, a pry bar, leaned against another wall, their metal parts crusted with rust, but still recognizable, and scattered across the floor were signs of gold extraction, a rocker box for separating gold from sediment, several dented metal pans, and what looked like a small smelting setup. Elena's pulse quickened. This had been an active mining claim, and from the look of it, one that had been abandoned suddenly. The tools were still here, left where they'd last been used, but there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck stand up. In the far corner of the chamber, partially hidden in shadow, stood a wooden chest bound with iron straps. It was roughly 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and perhaps 2 feet deep. Even from across the chamber, Elena could see the patina of age on its wood. She approached slowly, her light fixed on the chest. It wasn't locked. The latch hung open, as if whoever had last touched it had been in too much hurry to secure it. Or perhaps they'd never returned to do so. Elena knelt before the chest and hesitated, her hand hovering over the lid. Part of her felt like an intruder, like she was about to violate something that should remain undisturbed. But curiosity and the sheer impossibility of how she'd been led here overcame her hesitation. She lifted the lid. It opened with surprising ease, the hinges, though rusty, still functional. And there, in the beam of her flashlight, Elena saw something that made her heart stop. Gold. Not raw ore or flakes in a pan, but refined gold. Dozens of small ingots, each roughly the size of a candy bar, stamped with crude markings. They filled the bottom half of the chest, stacked neatly, gleaming dully in the flashlight's beam with that unmistakable warm glow that belonged to only one metal. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena sat back on her heels, her mind reeling. She was looking at what had to be tens of pounds of gold, possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars worth, maybe more, hidden in an abandoned mine that time had forgotten, that the forest had reclaimed, that no modern map would show. But how? Who had mined this gold, refined it, and left it here? And more importantly, why? People didn't abandon fortunes in gold. They didn't walk away from finds like this unless something prevented them from returning. Death, disaster, or danger. Elena's flashlight swept across the chamber again, looking for clues. Near the table, she spotted something she'd missed before, a leather-bound journal half buried in dust. She moved to it carefully and picked it up, marveling that the dry air had preserved it. The leather was cracked and stiff, but when she gently opened it, the pages inside were still readable. The handwriting was cramped and old-fashioned, written in faded ink. On the first page, in larger letters, was a name and date, Jeremiah Walsh, June 14, 1887. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she carefully turned pages, reading by flashlight. The journal told a story of a prospector who'd found gold in this hidden valley, working his claim in secret for fear that others would try to steal it. Jeremiah had been alone, paranoid, spending months extracting and refining his find, planning to emerge with wealth that would secure his family's future. But the later entries grew darker. Jeremiah wrote of autumn storms, of supplies running low, of the increasingly desperate realization that he'd waited too long. That winter was coming to the high mountains, and he might not make it out before the snows trapped him. The final entry was dated October 8, 1887. The first snow has fallen heavy. The trail back is blocked. I fear I have been too greedy, too cautious. The gold means nothing if I cannot return to my beloved Elena and the children. If God wills it, and these mountains release me in the spring, I will return for the gold. If not, may someone worthy find this record and use what I've gathered to do good in this world. My claim is legitimate, filed in Portland under claim number 347B. May it bring more blessing than it has brought me. Elena closed the journal carefully, her throat tight with emotion. The coincidence of the name struck her like a physical blow. Jeremiah had written of his beloved Elena. She looked around the chamber with new eyes, seeing not a treasure trove, but a tomb of dreams. Jeremiah Walsh had likely died trying to escape these mountains in the winter of 1887, his body probably long since reclaimed by the wilderness. His Elena and his children had never known what became of him, never found his claim, never benefited from the fortune he'd tried to secure for them. Until now, Elena sat in the dusty chamber as the implications washed over her. She'd been led here by an eagle she'd saved, following an impossible trail to an impossible discovery. A fortune in gold that had waited nearly a century and a half to be found. A dead man's legacy, preserved by chance and mountain solitude. And the man had shared her name with his wife, a connection across time that felt almost spiritual. Outside, she could hear Aurelius calling, the sound filtering down through the mine entrance. Elena checked her watch. It was getting late, and she had a decision to make. She couldn't carry all this gold out today. Couldn't make the 8-mile journey back to her cabin before nightfall while burdened with that weight. But she also couldn't just leave it here now that she'd found it. Couldn't walk away from this discovery without some proof it was real. Using her phone, she took dozens of photographs of the chamber, the chest, the gold, the journal. She photographed several pages of Jeremiah's writing, including the final entry, evidence, documentation. Then carefully, she selected one of the smaller ingots. It had to weigh at least 2 pounds, and placed it in her pack. She gently closed the chest lid, whispered an apology to Jeremiah Walsh's memory, and made her way back out into the fading afternoon light. Aurelius waited for her on the boulder, and Elena could swear the eagle looked satisfied. She laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that echoed off the rocks. "You knew," she said to the bird. "Somehow you knew. Did you see this place while you were recovering? Did you fly over it and recognize the valley?" The eagle tilted its head, and Elena shook hers ruefully. She was anthropomorphizing, assigning intention and knowledge that no wild animal could possess. But standing there in that hidden valley, gold heavy in her pack, and an eagle who'd led her here watching with knowing eyes, Elena Cruz found herself believing in possibilities that science couldn't explain. The journey back to her cabin was slower than Elena had anticipated. The weight of the gold ingot in her pack wasn't physically overwhelming, but the mental weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on her with every step. By the time darkness began to fall, she was only halfway home, forcing her to make camp in a small clearing she knew well from previous hikes. Aurelius had accompanied her for the first hour, circling overhead or perching on nearby trees, but as twilight deepened, the eagle had vanished into the gathering dusk. Elena built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat staring into the flames as her mind raced with questions and implications. The gold was real. The journal was real. Jeremiah Walsh had existed, had loved someone named Elena, had died trying to bring his fortune home to her. And now, 138 years later, another Elena had found what he'd left behind. The coincidence felt too significant to dismiss, though Elena's rational mind tried to find logical explanations. Common name, random chance, pattern-seeking human brain finding meaning where none existed, but the eagle. How did she explain Aurelius? How had a wild bird known to lead her to a hidden mine that even modern maps didn't show? She'd saved its life, yes, but animals didn't repay debts. They didn't form alliances with humans. They didn't guide people to hidden treasures like something out of a fairy tale. Elena pulled out the journal pages she'd photographed on her phone, reading them again by firelight. Jeremiah's words painted a picture of a man torn between ambition and love, between the lure of wealth and the pull of home. He'd been educated, his writing showed that, but also desperate, willing to work alone in secret. Paranoid about claim jumpers and thieves, she found herself wondering about the other Elena, the one who'd waited for a husband who never came home. Had she searched for him? Had she known about the claim? The journal mentioned it was filed in Portland, but Elena doubted any 1887 mining records would still exist or be accessible. She'd have to research that. As the fire burned down to embers, Elena wrapped herself in her emergency blanket and tried to sleep, but her mind refused to quiet. She kept thinking about the chest full of gold, sitting in that dark chamber waiting. How much was it worth? At current prices, gold was trading at around $2,000 per ounce. If those ingots averaged 2 pounds each, 32 ounces, that was $64,000 per ingot. And there had been dozens of them. 50, 60? She'd been too stunned to count accurately. The math was staggering. Even at a conservative estimate, she was looking at $3 to $4 million in gold. Maybe more. The number made her head spin. She'd lived simply for 3 decades, her needs modest, her life deliberately stripped of material excess. What would she do with that kind of money? The question felt almost obscene in the quiet of the mountain night. Elena finally drifted off into restless sleep. Her dreams filled with eagles and gold and a man named Jeremiah, trying to tell her something she couldn't quite hear. She woke at first light, stiff and cold but driven by renewed purpose. She needed to get home, needed to think this through properly, needed to figure out what came next. She broke camp quickly and set off at a brisk pace, arriving at her cabin by mid-morning. The first thing she did was weigh the ingot she'd taken. Her small scale wasn't designed for this, but after some improvisation, she got a reading: 2.4 pounds, just over 38 ounces. She did the calculation. At current market prices, this single ingot was worth approximately $76,000. Elena sat down heavily in her chair, staring at the dull yellow metal on her table. It was real. It was incredibly, impossibly real. For the next 2 days, Elena wrestled with what to do. Part of her wanted to go straight to the authorities, to report the find and let the legal system sort out ownership and claims. But another part of her hesitated. Jeremiah had said his claim was legitimate, filed legally. If that was true, and if no heirs had ever claimed it, then perhaps under mining law and finder's rights, the gold could be hers. She spent hours researching online, diving into Oregon mining law, abandoned claim regulations, and treasure trove statutes. The legal landscape was complex and contradictory. Some sources suggested that unclaimed mining fines on federal land belonged to the government. Others indicated that properly filed claims might remain valid indefinitely, transferable to whoever located them. Still others talked about finder's rights and the importance of good faith effort to locate original owners or heirs. Elena's head ached with the complexity of it. She needed professional help, a lawyer who specialized in mining claims and property law. But that meant revealing the discovery, bringing others into the secret. Once she did that, she'd lose control of the situation entirely. On the morning of the 3rd day, Elena made a decision. She would try to verify Jeremiah's claim first. If it was legitimate and she could prove it, she'd be in a much stronger position legally. She loaded her pack with supplies for an overnight trip and set out once more for the hidden valley. This time, she brought a larger backpack, rope, a digital scale, and a notebook. She also brought a handheld GPS unit to mark the exact coordinates of the mine. If this was going to become legal and official, she needed documentation. The journey was easier now that she knew the route, and she made good time. By early afternoon, she was standing once more at the entrance to the mine. She took a moment to mark the GPS coordinates carefully, taking multiple readings to ensure accuracy. Then she entered the chamber. In the daylight filtering through her powerful flashlight, the scene looked even more surreal. Elena spent the next hour methodically documenting everything. She photographed the chamber from every angle. She counted the ingots. There were 57 of them. She carefully weighed 5 of them on her digital scale. They ranged from 1.8 to 2.6 pounds each. She photographed every page of Jeremiah's journal, making sure the text was legible. Then she examined the chamber more carefully, looking for anything she might have missed. In a corner, she found a small leather pouch containing what looked like the original claim papers, miraculously preserved. The brittle documents confirmed what Jeremiah had written: claim, just 347B, filed in Portland, Oregon, on June 20th, 1887. In the name of Jeremiah Michael Walsh, Elena photographed these documents with shaking hands. This changed everything. If the claim was legitimate and no one had contested it or claimed it in the intervening 138 years, then legally the gold might actually belong to whoever held the claim. And if she'd discovered the abandoned claim, but first she'd need to verify that no heirs had ever claimed it, that it had truly been abandoned and forgotten. That would require research, possibly hiring a genealogist or legal researcher. It would take time and money. Elena decided to take 2 more ingots with her, evidence to show a lawyer if it came to that. 3 ingots total, worth over $200,000. She wrapped them carefully in cloth and placed them in her pack. The weight was significant but manageable. Before leaving, she took one more long look around the chamber. "Thank you, Jeremiah," she whispered into the darkness. "I'll honor your memory. I promise." She emerged into the late afternoon sunlight to find Aurelius perched on the familiar boulder, as if the eagle had been waiting for her. Elena smiled at the bird. "You've given me quite a puzzle to solve," she told it. Aurelius chirped and spread its wings, soaring up into the clear mountain air. Elena made camp in the valley that night, not wanting to attempt the ridge climb in failing light. As she sat by her fire, she found herself thinking about responsibility. If she ended up with legal claim to this gold, what would she do with it? Jeremiah had wanted it to provide for his family, to do good. Perhaps she could honor that intention. Her mind wandered to the possibilities: environmental conservation, protecting these mountains she loved, funding wildlife rehabilitation centers like the one where Aurelius had recovered, supporting programs for injured veterans or disadvantaged youth. The money could do real good in the world, could make a difference beyond her own needs. But first, she had to navigate the legal maze ahead of her. First, she had to ensure that everything was done properly, legitimately, honorably. Elena spent the next morning hiking back to her cabin, and by noon, she was once more at her kitchen table. The 3 gold ingots arranged before her like chess pieces in a game whose rules she was still learning. She picked up her phone and began making calls. She needed a lawyer, a good one, someone who specialized in mining claims and property law. She needed answers about Jeremiah's claim, about heirs, about her rights and responsibilities. The path forward would be complicated and potentially lengthy, but Elena had patience. She'd spent 30 years in these mountains learning that nature moved at its own pace, that some things couldn't be rushed. As she waited for callbacks from law firms, Elena sat on her porch and watched the sky. A familiar silhouette circled overhead, Aurelius keeping watch. Elena raised her hand in acknowledgement, and the eagle called out once before soaring away toward the mountains. Whatever came next, whatever legal battles or complications awaited her, Elena knew one thing with certainty: her life had changed irrevocably. The mountain woman who'd lived in peaceful solitude for 3 decades was about to step back into a world she'd left behind, carrying with her a secret worth millions and a story that no one would believe without proof. She smiled to herself, thinking of the journey ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but then nothing worth doing ever was. The mountains kept their silence, as they always had, holding their secrets close until the right person came along to unlock them. And somewhere in the wilderness, an eagle soared free, its debt to the woman who'd saved its life now repaid in ways neither could have foreseen. The law office of Morrison and Associates occupied a renovated Victorian house in downtown Portland, its dignified facade suggesting both tradition and discretion. Elena sat in the wood-paneled waiting room, acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her practical hiking clothes and worn boots. The receptionist had given her an appraising glance when she'd arrived, but the woman's professional demeanor had remained impeccable. "Ms. Cruz, Mr. Morrison will see you now." Thomas Morrison was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that suggested a mind that missed nothing. He rose from behind his massive oak desk to shake Elena's hand, his grip firm and confident. "Miss Cruz, your message indicated you had a rather unusual legal matter involving a historical mining claim," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I must admit you've piqued my curiosity. It's been years since I've dealt with anything from the territorial period." Elena had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed what she would say. Even so, her hands trembled slightly as she opened her backpack and carefully withdrew the cloth-wrapped ingot. She placed it on Morrison's desk and unwrapped it. The lawyer's eyebrows rose. "Is that gold?" "Yes, approximately 2.4 pounds of refined gold, roughly $76,000 worth at current market value." Elena met his eyes steadily. "And there are 56 more where this came from." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral, though Elena could see the wheels turning behind those sharp eyes. "I see. Perhaps you should start from the beginning, Miss Cruz." And so Elena told her story. Not the full story. She left out the details about Aurelius and how she'd been led to the mine, saying only that she'd been hiking in an area she'd never explored before and had stumbled upon a hidden entrance. She showed him the photographs on her phone, the chamber, the chest, the other ingots, and most importantly, Jeremiah Walsh's journal and the claim papers. Morrison listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Elena finished, he sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "This is extraordinary," he finally said. "If everything you've shown me is authentic, and we'll need to verify that, then we're looking at a potentially valid mining claim from 1887 that was never officially abandoned or transferred. The legal implications are complex. What are my rights?" Elena asked directly. Morrison rose and moved to one of his bookshelves, pulling down a thick volume. Oregon mining law is a fascinating intersection of federal and state regulations, territorial-era statutes, and common law principles. Let me be frank with you, Ms. Cruz. This could go several ways, and not all of them end with you retaining the gold. Elena's stomach tightened, but she nodded for him to continue. "First," Morrison said, ticking off points on his fingers, "we need to determine the current status of the land where the mine is located. Is it federal land, state land, or private property? If it's federal land, the government may have claim to any minerals found there, though there are exceptions for properly filed historical claims. Second, we need to verify that Jeremiah Walsh's claim was legitimate and properly filed. I'll need to search the historical records in Portland and possibly Salem. Claims from that era were often poorly documented or lost. Third, and here Morrison's expression grew more serious, we need to determine if Jeremiah Walsh has any living heirs who might have legal claim to his estate, including this gold. If such heirs exist and can be located, they would have a stronger claim than you do as finder. Fourth, there are tax implications. Even if you have legal claim to the gold, its value would be considered income. The IRS will want its share. Elena absorbed this information, her mind racing. What's the best-case scenario? Best case? We verify the claim was legitimate. We determine the land is federal, but that Walsh's claim predates current mineral rights regulations and remains valid. We conduct a thorough genealogical search and find no living heirs. You file to inherit the abandoned claim as finder. The court grants your petition. You pay applicable taxes on the value of the find. You walk away with perhaps $2.5 million after taxes and legal fees. Morrison paused. But Ms. Cruz, I want to be clear, that's an optimistic scenario. Any number of complications could arise, and worst case? The federal government claims the gold belongs to them. You're investigated for illegal mining activity or theft of government property. You end up with nothing and potentially facing criminal charges. Elena felt cold. I haven't done anything illegal. I believe you, Morrison said, his tone gentler. But once this becomes public, and it will have to become public if we pursue this legally, you'll be dealing with federal agencies. Possibly the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the IRS, and potentially the FBI if there's any suggestion of wrongdoing. The process could take years. What do you recommend? Morrison returned to his desk and opened a legal pad. I recommend we proceed methodically. First, I'll conduct preliminary research on the claim and the land status, quietly, before we notify any government agencies. That gives us a foundation to work from. Second, I'll engage a genealogist to search for Walsh heirs. Third, if the preliminary research is favorable, we'll need to formally report the find and begin the legal process of establishing your claim. He fixed her with a serious look. This will be expensive, Ms. Cruz. My retainer alone is $25,000, and the genealogical research, land surveys, and other expert consultations could easily run another $50,000 to $100,000, and there's no guarantee of success. Elena thought of the 3 ingots in her backpack. Liquid assets worth over $200,000. If I pay your retainer and the initial research costs, and you determine the case is promising, could we structure your fee as a percentage of the recovered gold? Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. A contingency arrangement? Unusual for this type of case, but yes, I'd consider that. Say 20% of whatever you ultimately recover, plus reimbursement of out-of-pocket expenses. Elena did the math quickly. If she ended up with even half the gold's value after taxes, 20% of that would be substantial. But it would align Morrison's interests with hers. 15%, she countered. Morrison smiled slightly. 18%, and that's my final offer. This is going to consume a significant amount of my time, Ms. Cruz, and the outcome is far from certain. Elena extended her hand. Deal, but I need one more thing from you. What's that? Absolute confidentiality until we're ready to make this public. I don't want word of this getting out prematurely. Morrison's handshake was firm. You have attorney-client privilege, Ms. Cruz. Nothing you've told me leaves this office without your permission. He opened a drawer and withdrew a contract. Let me draft a formal engagement letter. While I do that, there's something I need to know. Where exactly is this mine located? I'll need the GPS coordinates. Elena hesitated for just a moment before pulling out her phone and showing him the marked location. Morrison noted it carefully, then looked up with a knowing expression. Willamette National Forest. Federal land, he sighed. That complicates things, but not insurmountably. Historical mining claims on federal land have legal precedent. We'll need to research what mining regulations were in effect in 1887 versus now. Over the next hour, Elena and Morrison worked through the details of their agreement. She paid the retainer using funds from selling one of her gold ingots to a discreet dealer, Morrison recommended, a transaction that itself required careful documentation for tax purposes. By the time she left his office, Elena felt both relieved to have professional help and anxious about the complexity of what lay ahead. The drive back to the mountains took 4 hours, and Elena spent it mentally replaying every point Morrison had made. The one that worried her most was the possibility of living heirs. If Jeremiah Walsh had descendants, they would have the strongest legal claim to the gold. And that would be right, wouldn't it? The gold should go to Jeremiah's family if they could be found, but Elena couldn't help feeling a proprietary connection to the find. She'd discovered it. She'd been led to it by Aurelius. And the strange coincidence of names, Jeremiah's beloved Elena and her own name, felt like a sign she couldn't ignore. When she finally reached her cabin, twilight was falling. As she stepped out of her truck, a familiar silhouette swooped overhead. Aurelius landed on the Douglas fir, calling out in greeting. "Hello, friend," Elena called back. "I hope you know what you've gotten me into." The eagle tilted its head, and Elena could swear she saw amusement in those fierce yellow eyes. Over the following weeks, Elena fell into a strange rhythm. Morrison called regularly with updates on his research. He'd found the original claim filing in Portland's historical archives. Jeremiah Walsh had indeed filed legally, paying the required fees and meeting the standards of the day. The claim had never been officially closed or transferred. The genealogist Morrison hired, a woman named Dr. Patricia Reeves, began the painstaking work of tracing Jeremiah's family tree. Early results were promising but incomplete. Jeremiah had married Elena Chambers in 1881 in San Francisco. They'd had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The family had lived in Portland until Jeremiah's disappearance in 1887, but tracking what had happened to Eleanor Chambers Walsh and her children after 1887 was proving difficult. Records from that era were spotty, often destroyed in fires or simply never properly maintained. Dr. Reeves needed more time. Meanwhile, Elena continued her solitary life in the mountains, but it felt different now. She found herself going to the Hidden Valley regularly, sometimes to check on the mine, sometimes just to sit and think. Aurelius often accompanied her, the eagle seemingly understanding that their bond was something beyond normal human-animal interaction. One evening, sitting by the mine entrance watching the sunset, Elena spoke aloud to the empty air. "Jeremiah, if you can hear me somehow, I want you to know I'm trying to do right by you. If your family is out there, if your descendants can be found, they'll get what's rightfully theirs. But if they can't be found, I promise I'll use this gold the way you intended. To do good, to make a difference." The wind rustled through the pines, and Elena chose to interpret it as approval. 6 weeks into the research, Morrison called with news. "We have a development. Dr. Reeves has traced one of Jeremiah's daughters, Mary Walsh Thornton, to Seattle. Mary had 3 children. The genealogical line continues through her middle son, Robert Thornton. The trail goes cold in the 1940s, but Dr. Reeves believes she can pick it up with more time." Eleanor's heart sank, even as she acknowledged the justice of it. "So there may be living heirs, possibly." "Probably. Even. Dr. Reeves estimates another 3 months of research to determine if any direct descendants are alive today and to establish their legal standing." "Do what needs to be done," Eleanor said quietly. "I want the truth, whatever it is." After hanging up, Elena sat on her porch for a long time, watching the mountains and thinking about family, legacy, and fate. Whatever happened with the gold, she'd been part of something extraordinary. She'd saved an eagle's life and been led to a treasure that had waited nearly 140 years to be found. She'd touched a piece of history, connected with a long-dead prospector whose hopes and dreams had been preserved in gold and journal pages. That had to mean something, regardless of how the legal questions resolved. As darkness fell, Aurelius made one final pass over the cabin before disappearing into the night. Elena watched the eagle vanish and smiled. Whatever the future held, she'd faced it with integrity. And that, she thought, was worth more than all the gold in those mountains. Dr. Patricia Reeves called Elena directly 3 months later, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and frustration that Elena had come to recognize as the genealogist's professional passion wrestling with incomplete records. "I've traced the line," Dr. Reeves said without preamble. "Mary Walsh Thornton's descendants. It's a fascinating trail, actually. The family moved extensively. Seattle, then Los Angeles, then back to Oregon in the 1960s. Several branches, multiple marriages, name changes. But I found them." Elena gripped the phone tighter. "Living descendants?" 2 confirmed. "Both great-great-grandchildren of Jeremiah Walsh through his daughter Mary. One is in her 70s, living in a retirement community in Salem. The other is a man in his 60s, apparently quite successful, living in Lake Oswego." Elena's heart sank and soared simultaneously. The right thing was happening. Jeremiah's family would finally learn what had become of him, but it also meant the gold would likely not be hers. "What happens now?" "That's where it gets legally interesting," Dr. Reeves continued. "I've documented the genealogical connections thoroughly. They're solid, but there's a complication. Neither of these individuals has ever filed any claim to Jeremiah Walsh's estate. In fact, when I made preliminary contact very discreetly, just asking about family history, neither of them had any idea they were related to a gold prospector who disappeared in 1887. What does that mean legally? That's a question for Mr. Morrison, but essentially, while they have the strongest biological claim, they may not have a legal claim if they never took steps to assert inheritance rights and if Jeremiah's estate was never formally settled. The claim itself might be considered genuinely abandoned. Elena spent the rest of that day in a state of nervous anticipation. Morrison called that evening with his assessment. "It's a gray area," he admitted. "In most cases, direct descendants would have priority. But Oregon law has provisions for truly abandoned property, especially when the heirs have made no attempt to claim it and weren't even aware of its existence. We could potentially argue that after 138 years with no claim filed, the property reverted to whoever discovered the abandoned claim." "But that feels wrong," Elena said quietly. "These are Jeremiah's great-great-grandchildren. Don't they deserve to know? To have a choice?" Morrison was silent for a moment. "Ms. Cruz, I appreciate your ethical stance. But let me be clear. If we inform these individuals about the gold, they will almost certainly claim it, and they'll likely win. You'll have spent considerable money on legal fees and research for nothing. What would Jeremiah want? Elena asked. He wrote that he wanted the gold to provide for his family. These people are his family. They're also complete strangers who have lived perfectly fine lives without any expectation of this inheritance. You're the one who discovered it, who did the work to uncover this history. Elena stood and walked to her window, looking out at the mountains that had kept Jeremiah's secret for so long. Set up a meeting, she said finally, with both of them, if possible. I want to meet Jeremiah's family. She could hear the surprise in Morrison's voice. Ms. Cruz, I strongly advise, I know what you advise. But this isn't just about the law, Mr. Morrison. It's about doing what's right. Jeremiah died trying to get home to his Elena and his children. The least I can do is make sure his descendants know his story and have the chance to claim what he left behind. Morrison sighed. You're an unusual client, Ms. Cruz. Most people don't volunteer to give away millions of dollars. But if that's your decision, I'll arrange it. Though I want it on record that I recommended against this course of action. Duly noted, Elena said, with a slight smile. Elena made camp in the valley that night, not wanting to attempt the ridge climb in failing light. As she sat by her fire, she found herself thinking about responsibility. If she ended up with legal claim to this gold, what would she do with it? Jeremiah had wanted it to provide for his family, to do good. Perhaps she could honor that intention. Her mind wandered to the possibilities: environmental conservation, protecting these mountains she loved, funding wildlife rehabilitation centers like the one where Aurelius had recovered, supporting programs for injured veterans or disadvantaged youth. The money could do real good in the world, could make a difference beyond her own needs. But first, she had to navigate the legal maze ahead of her. First, she had to ensure that everything was done properly, legitimately, honorably. Elena spent the next morning hiking back to her cabin, and by noon she was once more at her kitchen table. The 3 gold ingots arranged before her like chess pieces in a game whose rules she was still learning. She picked up her phone and began making calls. She needed a lawyer, a good one, someone who specialized in mining claims and property law. She needed answers about Jeremiah's claim, about heirs, about her rights and responsibilities. The path forward would be complicated and potentially lengthy, but Elena had patience. She'd spent 30 years in these mountains learning that nature moved at its own pace, that some things couldn't be rushed. As she waited for callbacks from law firms, Elena sat on her porch and watched the sky. A familiar silhouette circled overhead, Aurelius keeping watch. Elena raised her hand in acknowledgement, and the eagle called out once before soaring away toward the mountains. Whatever came next, whatever legal battles or complications awaited her, Elena knew one thing with certainty: her life had changed irrevocably. The mountain woman, who'd lived in peaceful solitude for 3 decades, was about to step back into a world she'd left behind, carrying with her a secret worth millions, and a story that no one would believe without proof. She smiled to herself, thinking of the journey ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but then nothing worth doing ever was. The mountains kept their silence as they always had, holding their secrets close until the right person came along to unlock them. And somewhere in the wilderness, an eagle soared free, its debt to the woman who'd saved its life now repaid in ways neither could have foreseen. The law office of Morrison and Associates occupied a renovated Victorian house in downtown Portland, its dignified facade suggesting both tradition and discretion. Elena sat in the wood-paneled waiting room, acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her practical hiking clothes and worn boots. The receptionist had given her an appraising glance when she'd arrived, but the woman's professional demeanor had remained impeccable. Ms. Cruz. Mr. Morrison will see you now. Thomas Morrison was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that suggested a mind that missed nothing. He rose from behind his massive oak desk to shake Elena's hand, his grip firm and confident. Miss Cruz, your message indicated you had a rather unusual legal matter involving a historical mining claim, he said, gesturing for her to sit. I must admit you've piqued my curiosity. It's been years since I've dealt with anything from the territorial period. Elena had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed what she would say. Even so, her hands trembled slightly as she opened her backpack and carefully withdrew the cloth-wrapped ingot. She placed it on Morrison's desk and unwrapped it. The lawyer's eyebrows rose. "Is that gold?" "Yes, approximately 2.4 pounds of refined gold, roughly $76,000 worth at current market value." Elena met his eyes steadily. "And there are 56 more where this came from." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral, though Elena could see the wheels turning behind those sharp eyes. "I see. Perhaps you should start from the beginning, Ms. Cruz." And so Elena told her story. Not the full story. She left out the details about Aurelius and how she'd been led to the mine, saying only that she'd been hiking in an area she'd never explored before and had stumbled upon a hidden entrance. She showed him the photographs on her phone, the chamber, the chest, the other ingots, and most importantly, Jeremiah Walsh's journal and the claim papers. Morrison listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Elena finished, he sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "This is extraordinary," he finally said. "If everything you've shown me is authentic, and we'll need to verify that, then we're looking at a potentially valid mining claim from 1887 that was never officially abandoned or transferred. The legal implications are complex. What are my rights?" Elena asked directly. Morrison rose and moved to one of his bookshelves, pulling down a thick volume. Oregon mining law is a fascinating intersection of federal and state regulations, territorial-era statutes, and common law principles. Let me be frank with you, Ms. Cruz. This could go several ways, and not all of them end with you retaining the gold. Elena's stomach tightened, but she nodded for him to continue. "First," Morrison said, ticking off points on his fingers, "we need to determine the current status of the land where the mine is located. Is it federal land, state land, or private property? If it's federal land, the government may have claim to any minerals found there, though there are exceptions for properly filed historical claims. Second, we need to verify that Jeremiah Walsh's claim was legitimate and properly filed. I'll need to search the historical records in Portland and possibly Salem. Claims from that era were often poorly documented or lost. Third," and here Morrison's expression grew more serious, "we need to determine if Jeremiah Walsh has any living heirs who might have legal claim to his estate, including this gold. If such heirs exist and can be located, they would have a stronger claim than you do as finder. Fourth, there are tax implications. Even if you have legal claim to the gold, its value would be considered income. The IRS will want its share." Elena absorbed this information, her mind racing. "What's the best-case scenario?" "Best case, we verify the claim was legitimate. We determine the land is federal, but that Walsh's claim predates current mineral rights regulations and remains valid. We conduct a thorough genealogical search and find no living heirs. You file to inherit the abandoned claim as finder. The court grants your petition. You pay applicable taxes on the value of the find. You walk away with perhaps $2.5 million after taxes and legal fees." Morrison paused. "But Ms. Cruz, I want to be clear, that's an optimistic scenario. Any number of complications could arise. And worst case? Worst case? The federal government claims the gold belongs to them. You're investigated for illegal mining activity or theft of government property. You end up with nothing and potentially facing criminal charges." Elena felt cold. "I haven't done anything illegal." "I believe you," Morrison said, his tone gentler. "But once this becomes public, and it will have to become public if we pursue this legally, you'll be dealing with federal agencies, possibly the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the IRS, and potentially the FBI if there's any suggestion of wrongdoing. The process could take years. What do you recommend?" Morrison returned to his desk and opened a legal pad. "I recommend we proceed methodically. First, I'll conduct preliminary research on the claim and the land status, quietly before we notify any government agencies. That gives us a foundation to work from. Second, I'll engage a genealogist to search for Walsh heirs. Third, if the preliminary research is favorable, we'll need to formally report the find and begin the legal process of establishing your claim. He fixed her with a serious look. This will be expensive, Miss Cruz. My retainer alone is $25,000, and the genealogical research, land surveys, and other expert consultations could easily run another $50,000 to $100,000, and there's no guarantee of success. Elena thought of the 3 ingots in her backpack. Liquid assets worth over $200,000. If I pay your retainer and the initial research costs, and you determine the case is promising, could we structure your fee as a percentage of the recovered gold? Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. A contingency arrangement? Unusual for this type of case, but yes, I'd consider that. Say 20% of whatever you ultimately recover, plus reimbursement of out-of-pocket expenses. Elena did the math quickly. If she ended up with even half the gold's value after taxes, 20% of that would be substantial. But it would align Morrison's interests with hers. 15%, she countered. Morrison smiled slightly. 18%, and that's my final offer. This is going to consume a significant amount of my time, Ms. Cruz, and the outcome is far from certain. Elena extended her hand. Deal, but I need one more thing from you. What's that? Absolute confidentiality until we're ready to make this public. I don't want word of this getting out prematurely. Morrison's handshake was firm. You have attorney-client privilege, Ms. Cruz. Nothing you've told me leaves this office without your permission. He opened a drawer and withdrew a contract. Let me draft a formal engagement letter. While I do that, there's something I need to know. Where exactly is this mine located? I'll need the GPS coordinates. Elena hesitated for just a moment before pulling out her phone and showing him the marked location. Morrison noted it carefully, then looked up with a knowing expression. The meeting was arranged for 2 weeks later at Morrison's office. Elena spent that time wrestling with her conscience and her feelings. Part of her hoped the descendants wouldn't want the gold, would acknowledge her role as discoverer and allow her to keep it. But another part, the part that had read Jeremiah's journal dozens of times, that felt connected to his story, knew that the gold belonged to his bloodline. The day of the meeting arrived with Portland's typical autumn rain. Elena drove down from the mountains, her nerves making her hands grip the steering wheel too tightly. Morrison had briefed her on the 2 descendants. Margaret Walsh Brennan, 73, was a retired schoolteacher who'd lived modestly all her life. She'd been married twice, widowed once, divorced once, and had 3 children and 6 grandchildren. She knew almost nothing about her family history beyond her grandparents. David Thornton, 68, was the founder of a successful software company who'd sold it for a considerable sum in the 1990s. He'd been married to the same woman for 40 years, had 2 children, and spent most of his time now in philanthropic work. He'd known his family tree went back to California in the 1880s, but had never investigated further. Neither knew they were related to each other before Dr. Reeves's research had uncovered their connection. Morrison's conference room felt too formal for the meeting about to take place. Elena arrived first, taking a seat at the large table and trying to calm her racing heart. Morrison sat beside her, his legal pad at the ready. Margaret arrived next, a small woman with white hair and kind eyes, dressed in a practical pantsuit. She looked at Elena with obvious curiosity. "Ms. Cruz? I'm Margaret. I have to say, this is all very mysterious. Dr. Reeves said you discovered something about my family history." Before Elena could answer, David Thornton entered. He was tall and distinguished-looking, with grey hair and an air of calm authority. He shook hands with everyone before taking his seat. "I'll admit, I'm intrigued," David said. "Though I'm also a bit concerned. In my experience, when lawyers call mysterious meetings about family history, it's usually because someone's contesting a will, or there's been some fraud." "Nothing like that," Morrison assured him. He gestured to Elena. "Miss Cruz, perhaps you should explain." Elena took a deep breath. What I'm about to tell you will sound incredible, but I have documentation for all of it. She opened her laptop and turned it so both Margaret and David could see the screen. 6 months ago, I was hiking in the Cascade Mountains where I live, and I discovered a hidden mine. Inside, I found evidence of a prospector named Jeremiah Walsh, who worked a gold claim in 1887. She clicked through the photos, the mine entrance, the chamber, the tools, and then the journal. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes widening. That journal contains Jeremiah's story, Elena continued softly. How he found gold, how he extracted and refined it, and how he planned to bring it home to his wife, Elena, and their 3 children. But winter came early. The journal's final entry suggests Jeremiah never made it out of the mountains. He'd likely died of exposure or starvation trying to reach home. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. That's terrible. There's more, Elena said. She showed them the photographs of the claim papers. Jeremiah filed his claim legally in Portland, and he left behind everything he'd mined. She clicked to the photos of the gold. 57 gold ingots. At current market value, approximately $4 million. The room fell silent. David Thornton stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. Margaret had tears running down her cheeks. $4 million, David finally said. Just sitting there. For 138 years. Yes, Elena turned to face them directly. Mr. Morrison hired a genealogist to research Jeremiah's family. You're both his direct descendants. Margaret, you're descended from his daughter Mary. David, you're also descended from Mary through a different line. You're actually 4th cousins, Margaret wiped her eyes. I never knew. My grandmother never talked about her grandfather. I just assumed. I don't know what I assumed. David was more pragmatic. What's the legal status of this gold, Mr. Morrison? Morrison cleared his throat. That's complicated. The claim was legitimate, but never formally transferred or inherited. Ms. Cruz discovered the abandoned claim and could potentially file to inherit it under finder's rights. However, as direct blood descendants of Jeremiah Walsh, you two would likely have a stronger legal claim if you chose to assert it. And Ms. Cruz brought us here to tell us this? David asked, looking at Elena with new respect. She could have just claimed it herself? She insisted on this meeting, Morrison confirmed, his tone suggesting he still thought his client was making a mistake. Elena met David's eyes. Jeremiah died trying to bring this gold home to his family. You're his family. You should know the truth and have the opportunity to claim what he left behind. Margaret stood abruptly and walked around the table to embrace Elena. That's the most honest thing I've ever heard, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Thank you for finding him, for telling his story. Elena found herself tearing up as she returned the embrace. David remained seated, his fingers drumming on the table as his mind clearly worked through the implications. This is extraordinary, he finally said. A piece of family history I never knew existed. A great-great-grandfather who died trying to secure his family's future. He looked at Margaret, then at Elena. I think we need to discuss this. The 3 of us, without the lawyers for a moment. Would that be acceptable? Morrison looked like he wanted to object, but Elena nodded. Of course. The lawyers left the room, and Elena sat back down at the table with Margaret and David. An awkward silence stretched for a moment before David spoke. Ms. Cruz, may I call you Elena? She nodded. Elena, I want to be frank. $4 million is a significant sum, even for someone in my position. For Margaret, on a teacher's retirement, it would be life-changing. By rights, perhaps by law, this gold could be ours. But you found it. You did the work. You could have kept this secret and claimed it yourself. He paused. Why didn't you? Elena thought about her answer carefully. Because I read Jeremiah's journal. I know what the gold meant to him. It wasn't about being rich. It was about providing for the people he loved. When I found out he had living descendants, I couldn't just take that away from you. It wouldn't have been right, Margaret dabbed at her eyes again. What would you do with the money? If it were yours? Elena hadn't expected that question, but she answered honestly. I'd use some of it to protect the mountains where I live. Conservation easements, maybe, or buying land to keep it wild. I'd support wildlife rehabilitation, and I'd set up a fund to help people who want to live more sustainably, to find their place in nature the way I did. She smiled slightly. Jeremiah wanted his gold to do good. I'd try to honor that. David and Margaret exchanged a long look, the kind of wordless communication that somehow transcended their newly discovered kinship. I propose something, David said slowly. Not a legal proposition yet, just an idea between the three of us. We split it 3 ways. Margaret and I each take a third as Jeremiah's heirs. Elena takes a third as the discoverer. We all pay our own legal fees and taxes out of our shares. Elena's breath caught. You don't have to. You're right, we don't have to, Margaret interrupted gently. But it feels right. You gave us our great-great-grandfather's story. You gave us closure that our family never had. And frankly, I don't need $4 million. $1.33 million? That's more than enough to change my grandchildren's lives, to set up trust funds for their education. She smiled. And it means you can do those good things you mentioned. I'm already wealthy, David added. Another $4 million wouldn't change my life substantially. But knowing this story, having this connection to my family's past, that's valuable beyond money. And having the opportunity to honor both Jeremiah's intentions and your integrity, that's worth the compromise. Elena felt overwhelmed. Are you sure? This is a lot of money to just give away. We're not giving it away, David said firmly. We're sharing it with someone who earned it by being honest when she didn't have to be. There's a difference, Margaret nodded. Besides, in a way, your family too. You share a name with Jeremiah's Elena. You found him when his own family couldn't. That has to mean something. The 3 of them sat in that conference room. 3 strangers bound by a dead prospector's dream and a fortune in gold, and worked out the details of their agreement. When they called the lawyers back in, Morrison looked stunned by the proposal. You're sure about this? He asked his client. Elena looked at Margaret and David, seeing in their faces something like kinship, and nodded. I'm sure. Draw up the agreement. Over the next several months, the legal machinery ground forward. The find was reported to federal authorities, who investigated and ultimately determined that the historical claim was valid and that the gold could be divided among the 3 parties per their agreement. The IRS took its share in taxes. Legal fees and research costs were paid. And when everything was settled, Elena Cruz found herself with just over $1 million after all expenses, far less than the potential $4 million, but more than enough to change her life if she chose to let it. But perhaps more valuable than the money was the friendship that developed between Elena, Margaret, and David. They met regularly, sharing meals and stories. Margaret's grandchildren were fascinated by their great-great-great-grandfather's tale. David helped Elena set up a foundation to support the causes she cared about, and through it all, Aurelius watched from the mountain skies, a silent guardian of the woman who'd saved its life and who'd been rewarded with a treasure that went far beyond gold. Spring came to the Cascade Mountains with an explosion of wildflowers and the return of migratory birds. Elena stood on her porch, coffee in hand, watching the morning mist rise from the valleys below. Life had changed dramatically in the 6 months since the gold had been divided. Yet in many ways, it remained remarkably the same. She still lived in her cabin, still walked the trails she'd maintained for 3 decades, still found her deepest peace in the solitude of the wilderness. But now, that solitude was punctuated by video calls with lawyers, accountants, and the board members of the foundation she'd established, the Jeremiah Walsh Conservation Trust. The name had been Margaret's suggestion, and Elena had loved it immediately. It honored the man whose unintended legacy had made everything possible while serving the purpose he'd intended, doing good in the world. The Foundation's mission was threefold: protecting wilderness areas through conservation easements and land purchases, supporting wildlife rehabilitation and research, and providing grants to individuals seeking to transition to more sustainable, nature-connected lifestyles. Elena served as president, with David as treasurer and Margaret as secretary. They'd recruited 3 other board members with expertise in conservation, wildlife biology, and non-profit management. Elena's phone rang, interrupting her reverie. It was Claire Donovan, the Foundation's executive director, a former National Park Service ranger who jumped at the chance to run the organization. Morning. Elena, I wanted to give you an update on the Morrison Creek purchase before today's board meeting. Morrison Creek was a pristine watershed adjacent to the Willamette National Forest, 5,000 acres that had been slated for logging before the Foundation stepped in with an offer to buy the land and place it under permanent conservation protection. It would be their first major acquisition. The seller has agreed to our terms, Claire continued, excitement evident in her voice. We'll close in 30 days. Once we do, we'll be protecting one of the last intact old-growth corridors in the region. The wildlife implications alone are staggering. It's prime habitat for northern spotted owls, marbled murrelets, and yes, bald eagles. Elena smiled at the mention of eagles. That's incredible news, Claire. Jeremiah would be proud. After hanging up, Elena prepared for her weekly hike to the hidden valley where it had all begun. She'd been back dozens of times since the gold was removed, the mine now empty, except for Jeremiah's journal, which Elena had donated to the Oregon Historical Society. They'd created a special exhibit about the prospector and his rediscovery, carefully omitting the exact location of the mine to prevent treasure hunters from disturbing the site. As she reached the ridge above the valley, a familiar form swooped down from above. Aurelius had remained a constant presence in her life, the eagle often appearing on her hikes, sometimes following her for miles, sometimes simply perching nearby as if keeping her company. "Hello, old friend," Elena called out. "Come to check on me." The eagle circled twice, calling out, before landing on a nearby snag. Elena had long since stopped trying to rationalize their bond. Science couldn't explain it, but that didn't make it any less real. She sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, and Aurelius glided down to perch on a boulder a few yards away. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, woman and bird in companionable silence, watching the play of light and shadow across the mountains. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Can't wait for tomorrow. The kids are so excited." Tomorrow was the dedication ceremony for the first project funded by the Foundation, the Jeremiah Walsh Wildlife Rehabilitation Annex, at the center where Aurelius had recovered. Margaret was bringing her 3 grandchildren, and David was flying in from a business trip in Seattle. Dr. Santos would be there, along with several other board members and supporters. That evening, Elena received an unexpected email that made her sit down hard in her chair. The subject line read, "Inquiry from Walsh Descendant." The message was from a woman named Rebecca Steinberg, living in Australia. She'd seen the Oregon Historical Society's exhibit online and believed she might be descended from Jeremiah Walsh's youngest child, a son named Thomas, who'd moved to Australia in the early 1900s. Elena immediately forwarded the email to Dr. Reeves, the genealogist. If Rebecca was indeed another descendant, she had a claim to a share of the gold. Elena felt a moment of panic. Would they have to redo everything? Would the legal settlement be challenged? Dr. Reeves called within an hour. "I'll need to verify her lineage, but if she's who she claims to be, it could complicate things. The original settlement agreement was based on the heirs we knew about at the time. Another heir might argue they were entitled to a share. What should I do? For now, nothing until I verify the connection. But Elena, you should know that even if she is a legitimate heir, her claim would be weakened by the fact that the estate has already been settled with the participation of known heirs. A court probably wouldn't overturn the entire settlement." Elena spent a sleepless night worrying about this new development, but by morning she'd made a decision. If Rebecca was truly Jeremiah's descendant, Elena would offer to share part of her own portion with the woman. It was what Jeremiah would have wanted. The dedication ceremony for the rehabilitation annex was held on a perfect spring morning. A crowd of about 50 people gathered outside the Wild Wings Center. where Dr. Santos gave a speech about the importance of wildlife rehabilitation and how the new facility would allow them to help twice as many injured birds. When it was Elena's turn to speak, she stood before the crowd feeling uncharacteristically nervous. Public speaking had never been her strength. "I'm not good with big groups," she began, earning a few sympathetic chuckles. "I'm more comfortable with trees and mountains than people. But I wanted to say a few words about why this place matters so much." She told the story, or at least the public version of it, of finding an injured eagle, bringing it here, watching it heal and return to the wild. She talked about Dr. Santos's skill and dedication, about the importance of giving injured wildlife a second chance. "Jeremiah Walsh died trying to secure his family's future," Elena said, her voice growing stronger. "He couldn't have imagined that his gold would end up funding places like this, protecting wild spaces, helping animals. But I think he'd be pleased. He was trying to do good in his own way, and now, 138 years later, he's still doing good." Margaret was crying openly by the time Elena finished. David looked moved, and Dr. Santos came over to embrace her. "Thank you," the veterinarian whispered. "This facility will save hundreds of birds over the years. Thousands, maybe. That's a legacy worth having." After the ceremony, Margaret's grandchildren, ages 8, 12, and 14, peppered Elena with questions about living in the mountains, about finding the gold, about the eagle that had led her there. "Is it true the eagle knew where the gold was?" asked the youngest, a bright-eyed girl named Sophie. Elena smiled. "I don't know if it knew about the gold specifically, but yes, the eagle led me there. Sometimes I think animals understand more than we give them credit for. Can we see it?" "The eagle? Maybe," Elena said. "It lives wild in the mountains, but if it chooses to visit us, you might spot it." Elena smiled to herself and began the hike back to her cabin, guided by starlight and the intimacy of a trail she'd walked 1,000 times. She was home in every sense that mattered, and she was, finally, at peace with who she'd become and what she'd chosen to do with the extraordinary gift an eagle had led her to discover. 3 years into the Foundation's operation, Elena received a letter that would shift her perspective once again. It came from one of the scholarship recipients, the young woman named Sage Martinez, who'd been studying salmon restoration. "Dear Ms. Cruz," Sage wrote in her careful hand, "I wanted to let you know that I've completed my master's research project, and the results are remarkable. Working in streams within the Morrison Creek watershed that your foundation protected, I've documented a 340% increase in coho salmon spawning compared to similar streams in logged areas. Your decision to protect that land is quite literally giving life to thousands of fish each year. Those fish in turn feed eagles, bears, otters, and countless other species. They nourish the forest when they die and decompose. The ripple effects of your conservation choice are almost impossible to fully quantify. But I wanted you to know, you're not just protecting land. You're protecting an entire web of life. Thank you for making my research possible. And thank you for being the kind of person who follows eagles." Elena read the letter 3 times, each time feeling the weight of its message settle more deeply into her bones. She'd known intellectually that protecting land mattered, but seeing the concrete data, 340% increase in spawning salmon, made it visceral and real. She forwarded the letter to the board with a simple note. "This is why we do what we do." David's response came within minutes. "Frame that letter. Every time you doubt whether this work matters, read it again." The foundation had indeed grown beyond anything Elena had initially imagined. They now protected over 15,000 acres across 3 states, funded 7 wildlife rehabilitation projects, and had awarded scholarships to 23 students. The endowment had grown to $12 million through careful management and additional donations. Claire had hired 2 full-time staff members and 3 interns, but growth brought complications. Meetings multiplied, decisions became more complex, and Elena found herself spending less time in the mountains and more time in conference rooms and on phone calls. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd become successful at conservation work to the point where she had less time to actually be in nature. Margaret noticed, of course. She had a way of seeing through Elena's polite assurances that everything was fine. "You need to train a successor," Margaret told her bluntly during one of their regular coffee meetings in Portland. "Someone who can take on more of the day-to-day operations so you can step back into an advisory role." "You're burning out, Elena, and that doesn't serve anyone. I can't just hand this off to someone else," Elena protested. "It's Jeremiah's legacy." It's bigger than any one person," Margaret interrupted gently. "That's the point. You've built something that will outlast all of us, but only if you build it strong enough to continue without you at the helm. Jeremiah's mistake was trying to do everything alone. Don't repeat it." The words stung, but Elena recognized the truth in them. She brought the issue to the next board meeting, and after much discussion, they decided to hire an associate director who could gradually take over many of Elena's operational responsibilities. The search process took 6 months, but they eventually found someone perfect, Dr. James Blackfeather, a Siletz tribal member with a PhD in ecology and 15 years of experience in conservation work. In his interview, he spoke passionately about the connection between indigenous land management practices and modern conservation science, about the importance of protecting not just wilderness, but the cultural heritage embedded in landscapes. "Land isn't just habitat," James told the interview panel. "It's memory. It's relationship. It's the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we belong. When we protect wild places, we're protecting human possibility as much as we're protecting wildlife." Elena knew immediately he was the right choice. James started in January of the Foundation's 4th year, and his presence transformed the organization. He brought new energy, new perspectives, and new connections with tribal nations and indigenous conservation groups. Within 6 months, he'd initiated partnership projects with 3 different tribes, helping them acquire ancestral lands and establish their own conservation programs. With James handling much of the operational work, Elena gradually reclaimed her time in the mountains. She began leading small guided hikes for donors and supporters, sharing not just the landscape, but her philosophy of connection with wilderness. These intimate groups, never more than 6 people, became one of her favorite aspects of the Foundation's work. On one such hike in late spring, Elena led a group that included a tech CEO considering a major donation, a journalist writing about conservation, and a young couple who'd been inspired by the documentary about Jeremiah Walsh. As they reached a vista overlooking the Morrison Creek watershed, Aurelius made an appearance, soaring overhead before landing on a nearby snag. The tech CEO, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Lynn, stopped in her tracks. "Is that the eagle? The one from the story?" Elena nodded. "That's Aurelius. Still around after all these years. How old would it be now?" Patricia asked. "Somewhere around 8 or 9 years old, based on when I found it. Bald eagles can live 30 years or more in the wild, so it's still quite young, relatively speaking." As if aware it was being discussed, Aurelius spread its wings and called out, the sound echoing across the valley. Then the eagle launched from its perch and began circling overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. The young woman in the group, her name was Jasmine, watched with tears streaming down her face. "It's so free," she whispered. "So completely, perfectly free." Elena understood the emotion behind those tears. She'd felt it herself countless times, watching wild creatures simply being wild. There was something transcendent about witnessing that freedom, that authentic existence without self-consciousness or pretense. That evening, after the group had returned to their vehicles and departed, Patricia Lynn stayed behind to talk with Elena privately. "I want to make a substantial donation," Patricia said without preamble. $5 million. But I want it used for something specific, land protection, with a focus on creating wildlife corridors between existing protected areas. Climate change is fragmenting habitats. Animals need to be able to move, to migrate, to follow food sources and suitable temperatures. Protecting isolated parcels isn't enough anymore. Elena was stunned by the amount, but she focused on Patricia's point. You're absolutely right about corridors. We've been discussing the concept, but haven't had the resources to pursue it at scale. Now you do, Patricia said. I'll have my lawyer draw up the donation agreement. I want to see this happen before I'm too old to hike back here and see the results. Over the next 2 years, the Corridor Initiative became the Foundation's flagship project. Working with federal agencies, other conservation groups and tribal nations, they identified priority corridors connecting existing protected areas across the Cascade Range. The work was complex and politically challenging, requiring negotiation with dozens of different stakeholders. But James proved masterful at building the necessary coalitions. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.